Greetings all. We hope you have your seatbelts on because we are about to take a trip. Now, when I was growing up, I actually remember the first Earth Day in 1970. I was in 5th grade, so you know how old I am. And we said that global warming, or the idea of global warming was foreign, but we thought that basically the pollution we were sending up into the air was going to block out the sun, and we were going to go into the next ice age. But of course, we know better than that. And of course, when you were looking at those images that I just showed you, it could all be a little bit imposing. We hear from the astronauts who actually went ahead and looked at the Earth from the space station or whatever the vehicle might have been, that they were awed, and it was very, very imposing. And I think that's a problem that all of us have, that we try to deal with these issues the best we can, and it all seems a little bit imposing. And so today on Earth Day, we are going to take a totally different approach. We will be looking at how we can go ahead and define for ourselves what are the areas that we can actually go ahead and influence. And our subject, of course, is the 15-minute circular city. And so first, I'd like to go ahead and start with some of our motivation. And it comes down to basically 3 points. The first one, we talk within circularity, we talk about closed loops. And the idea is that the shorter the distance, the closer the loop actually is. So if we really want to make a loop closed, and we need to make it as small as possible, then it has to be taking place within our own neighborhood, because that's the shortest one that I could think of. The second motivation for me was looking to come up with new financial models. Very often we talk about the problems tied to take, make, and dispose, and especially that make part where we produce things that actually nobody needs, and we call that progress. Well, if we were able to go ahead and move that much closer to where we are, then we would have a better idea of what we actually need. And the idea here would be that we could actually go ahead and take the money that we're sending off to a stock exchange or whatever we might be sending that money off to, we can actually go ahead and invest in our own community. And that was a big motivator for me prior to the pandemic. And then lastly, this was a phenomenon that I've been noticing for a number of years. And I think that very possibly you might be running across a similar situation. It's all tied to the dying of our streets. So what am I actually talking about? I took a trip where it was very pronounced, went to a larger town outside of Austria. Won't name the name because in essence it could have been anywhere. And you saw at one point in time the street was very prominent. Large street, and the avenue was very, very wide. And I noticed that every single shop had something, and I didn't know what it was. And then I noticed that actually it was every second shop was empty. And the feeling that I had after walking down that street, magnificent street, you wouldn't, and it was a wonderful day, it was a beautiful day. But I had the feeling that street was dying. And in addition, I had the feeling that it wasn't very safe there. And then I started looking around. So who else is on the street? Can I trust them? So if we want to go ahead and make a change, we need to go ahead and start in our own backyard. And I thought it was very poignant. It wasn't planned this way, but a lot of things are based on kismet. We we take this concept of Earth Day and we make it ours. And we make it ours by actually going ahead and doing something that we can go ahead and manage. So let me go ahead and talk a little bit about our journey, the journey that we started in actually trying to take things into our own hands, following the adage you see on your screen. If you want something done, you have to do it on your own. Do it yourself. So I live here in Vienna. So if I'm going to make a difference, it's going to have to take place here. And of course, you might have heard of this concept called the 15-minute city. Let me go ahead and do this way. As you can tell, it's live, warts and all. If we are going to go ahead and make a difference, we invest in where we actually live. And the idea was for us to go ahead and define what is that place that we want to live in. And that's basically where the journey actually started. A new approach to redesign Vienna to improve our actual surroundings. And this is really where the problem starts. We started going ahead and building these great malls, these huge malls outside of town. And of course, one of the big problems we have with these malls, if you ever want to go there, let me go back a little bit. Yes, there we go. If you want to go out to these malls, you need to have a car. You need to have a car. And of course, this whole idea of shopping as being an experience really started with these malls. But there was one problem. So we've gone ahead and built these malls, and we need a car. But one of the collateral damage that took place is that our city centers are dying. But where did the trash end up staying? Yes, it stayed where we live. And so we go ahead and send the business somewhere else. We lose the business within our streets, and the trash stays ours. So the idea was, can we go ahead and take something from this concept called the 15-minute city? And perhaps you might have heard of it. This is not something that I invented. The first time I had heard of the concept was tied to initiative that started in Paris in 2016, and then performing some research, I found out that actually there are a number of cities who've actually started with this quest of making sure that everything that you need, everything that's essential, is within 15 minutes. And the motivation was primarily tied to mobility, so that we get people outside of the cars and taking public transportation. Basic tenet of the 15-minute city, you only need 15 minutes either with public transportation, taking a bike, or by foot to get anything that's essential. But my motivation was a little bit different. I live in a city where public transportation is actually pretty good. But what I wanted to do was bring life back to where I live. And that was truly the motivation. And so we started with the great spirit, and we said, yes, we're going to go ahead and make it happen. And we thought, well, considering the dire straits of our community right now, if we were to go to the politicians and go ahead and explain our story, then they should welcome us with open arms, because we weren't asking for money. What we were asking for is just their support. And we toyed around with these ideas of what can we call it. And of course, we wanted to make sure that it was recognizable for Viennese, so clearly wouldn't stay the 15-minute circular city. And so we came up with this idea called kreislaufplatz. And the translation into English would be the circular square. And I'd like to go ahead and ask you, when you hear this phrase, circular square, what do you think of? I can tell you what I think of. I think of a place where it's ours. We can hang out if we want. We know the people that are there. And it's part of that sense of belonging. This actually belongs to us. And so these were very strong values that we wanted to go ahead and transfer with this concept. And with that, the Kreislaufplatz was born. But of course, as is always the case, things are never as simple as you think. And so we went ahead and reached out to some politicians and thinking that they were going to actually go ahead and welcome us with open arms. But little did we realize that even though we weren't asking for money, even though we were donating our time, we were rattling the cage. And so it didn't quite work out the way we want. And this is kind of a depiction of the way that we felt after some of our conversations tied to going ahead and establishing the 15-minute city. Now, I'm talking to you about this now, so that means clearly that it did not deter us, not in any way, shape, or form. Maybe about 5 minutes after the first shellacking, but we decided to actually go ahead and change our direction. And that's where I'd like to spend most of what I want to talk about here. And it's all tied to five components that I'd like to explain a little bit more in detail. The first one would be awareness. And part of the problem, this is really going back to my own story. I think it's always easier if you go ahead and admit straight out that you were a sinner at one time. In fact, I probably sin as much as everybody. You think that you're living sustainably, and you continue on your merry way, and then all of a sudden you start examining your habits, and you start thinking about what you are actually doing day in and day out, and then you come to the realization that actually you're probably one of the biggest sinners around. I go ahead and look at what I threw away in the trash, and I said, that's terrible because I'm as bad as everybody else. You know, the whole idea is you throw it away, and with that, it's gone. So awareness is the first step. We need to be aware of the seriousness of the problem, and we need to be aware of what we are actually inflicting. And of course, we go through this guilt trip. And after we get past this, then we think, okay, good. So I've come to terms, I've calmed down. So what's the next problem that we have? The next issue is directly tied to a lack of knowledge of what could be my next step. So I think, great, I'm aware now, but what do I do after that? So the next step is tied to instructions. Giving people instructions, receiving instructions on our own, and trying to figure out how best can we go ahead and approach this. So we have the awareness part taken care of. Now we know how to do it. But do we feel empowered? Do we feel that we can actually go ahead and take this new knowledge, and can we go ahead and make a difference? And I'd like to go back again to where we started this conversation, with the Earth being so huge and it's so imposing. And we keep hearing these stories about global warming, whatever the problem may be. And we think it doesn't matter what we do because there's no way in the world that we're going to be able to solve it. But I have something that I would like to go ahead and tell you at this point. That's right. We cannot solve this on our own. I can't solve it, nor can you. But together, we can. Together, we can make a difference. And that's the challenge I'd like to go ahead and raise, certainly to all of you that are watching live, and for those who might be watching the video later on. That's the wish, and that's the challenge that I have for all of you. So we've gone ahead. Let's continue on this journey. We have awareness. We know what to do. We have the instructions. We feel we can do it. We feel empowered. But it still won't last, because we need to build incentives into this model so that it just kind of works. And as I mentioned earlier, the closed loops allow us to actually go ahead and make sure that we're performing these actions in a way that actually creates that community that comes out in our own image. But we need to make sure that there are incentives. Now, incentives aren't necessarily just monetary. Incentives are very much tied to what we call intrinsic motivators. And an intrinsic motivator in comparison to an extrinsic motivator, which is tied to cash, or it could be many other titles are another big extrinsic motivators. An intrinsic motivator is something that you actually feel. And it's tied to two components. The first one is autonomy. You feel that you could do it on your own. And you relish that you're able to go ahead and make that decision and you can manage it on your own. And then the second part is mastery. And of course, for all those things that are worthwhile, we all go through setbacks. And of course, I described the setback tied to the politicians where perhaps maybe I was a little bit too blue-eyed. But eventually you get it. Eventually you realize that you can master this. And then you relish in the fact that you were able to do it. And you can go ahead and measure where you were beforehand and what you've actually accomplished. Now, this isn't going to be for everybody, unfortunately. But I tend to think that most people are actually driven by this. And then the last part that I like to go ahead and focus on is this inclusiveness. You know, it's great if we go ahead and do it for ourselves and for our friends, but we live in a community where we need to make sure that everybody's taken care of. And here I have some news, especially on this day, Earth Day, where we concentrate so much on the environment. If we're not capable of actually solving the problems tied to inequality, then this is clearly not going to stick. Let's go ahead and continue with the journey. Right. And so this is what we actually want to bring to our town. And we started with one campaign that we think is actually pretty easy for anybody to go ahead and set up. And I'm always surprised that we keep going for the difficult parts. We never start thinking about the low-hanging fruit. Now, within this concept of circular economy, we talk about repair, recycle, reuse, and we tend to forget that there are a number of people within our community that are actually already practicing circular economy. They are merchants who are actually going ahead and offering a circular economy solution. But one of the issues that we have tied to this concept of circularity in our own town, we keep thinking it's somewhere else. We don't go ahead and look in our own neighborhood to find out who is actually going ahead and performing these activities. Now, I can only speak for where I live, so I would never make a claim for anywhere else. But I've noticed there are plenty of establishments that are already performing these activities that we call circular economy. And I kept thinking the whole time, how come we don't know them? And then I came up with a solution. Yeah, they're not part of our bubble. And very often, they are immigrants. So what we decided to do was create this logo. Let me go ahead and continue with this campaign that we're setting together. We created a logo, as you could see, and it would have the kreislaufplatz included in it. And we would honor those individuals, those groups within our community that are already practicing circular economy, with the intention of, one, allowing them to shine. Secondly, to show people maybe we're not so bad off after all. And then thirdly, maybe if they see that we are already practicing circular economy, maybe the gap between where we are right now and this idea of circularity, maybe it's not so big. And so we went ahead and we started putting this campaign together. And so our intention is within the next six to 9 months to actually go ahead and set up a pilot where we say that Vienna is a circular town. And here's what we have to prove it. Now, the second part I'd like to go ahead and focus on is tied to this idea. Once we finally get past this pandemic, a lot of us feel that it's going to be a strange time. On the one hand, there's something, and I could only speak from my own experience, and I tend to think a number of you feel the same way as I do. I miss people. I miss people a lot. And I realized that I cannot manage this half-heartedly. In other words, either I'm able to go ahead and embrace humanity, or I'd rather go ahead and stay in my bunker. But that day is coming. I could smell it. That day is coming. So the question is, don't we want to go ahead and prepare ourselves for that day? As I mentioned earlier, we expect a number of challenges specifically tied to the economy, with shops perhaps not necessarily being able to make it. Now, think about what I talked about earlier with this idea of the streets being empty and that feeling that it actually brings across, and certainly to me, and I suspect to some of you as well. Can't we turn that around and take over the streets and make them ours? So I'd like to go ahead and share another concept here. And before I go and start with this video, I need to tell you a little bit about this idea. And this might sound funny to a number of you who only know this condition that we currently have today, where we have streets and they are made for cars. Can I tell you a secret? We had streets before there were cars, believe it or not. And in fact, the challenge, of course, is you weren't going to mess with a horse, but people would walk through the streets. The streets were a place to meet. And then we had the reality taking place on the streets between pedestrians and cars. And here, as you can see, this is a typical case of people walking across the street. And this was a promotion to show that it's not very healthy for people to go ahead and do that. And a number of individuals were being rather flagrant, let's go ahead and say. And yeah, I thought it was quite interesting. Let me go ahead and move this one. I thought it was quite interesting. I started studying up on the subject. It took place around the 1920s, where this confrontation hit a pinnacle. And there were a number of initiatives taking place to actually go ahead, and citizens were saying that cars should never go past a certain speed limit, that they would actually go ahead and control who actually rules the streets. And then public, the vested interest took charge, and they started with this campaign called jaywalking. Now, the word jaywalking has a bit of a different history, but looking at it within this context, jaywalking means that you are walking across the street in an area that you're not allowed to go ahead and perform that action. And they advertised this. They kept playing this message over and over again, to the point of where people just thought, well, of course, then the cars own the roads and we need to obey the rules. Now, there was something very funny that I found within the studies that I wanted to go ahead and play you today. This was a contraption that was put together to limit the damage, quote unquote, that the pedestrians would actually go ahead and cause. So you see this apparatus that was put in front of the car. So here comes the car. Oops, there's a pedestrian. Watch. Oh, we caught the pedestrian. And here we go again. Yep, we caught the pedestrian. So what is this message that we are going ahead And let me move this one. What's this message that was being broadcast here? People get in the way. And so me as a driver need to go ahead and make sure that I manage the damage as best I can. And this was something that was produced roughly around the time of the Second World War, just prior to the Second World War. And so we've gone through this complete journey. We started at the beginning of this presentation talking about the malls that we would build outside where you needed a car. And we take these things for granted. But it's gotten much worse, folks. It's gotten much, much worse. A number of us are aware of what took place last year with George Floyd. And I started doing some research to better understand this idea of jaywalking. And I kept running across all kinds of videos that I didn't expect. And then I realized, aha, jaywalking has another purpose as well. So I just took a small clip of somebody where we were able to go ahead and define that they were causing problems. And so with that, we've come up with a pretense to go ahead and incarcerate people. And in this particular case, the video I just showed you, the pretense was they were jaywalking. So when I think about us going ahead and taking over the streets, then it's quite clear that this problem is actually much bigger than I realized. Let's go ahead and move on to something a little bit more joyful. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about coming up with something that's meaningful for people. And so we thought the best thing is to actually go ahead and talk to individuals. So we started with a campaign. Let me go ahead and move here. And we call it regenerative communities. Let me go ahead and explain to you a little bit about what this campaign's all about. And then I'll show one of the pieces that we went ahead and put together. It's based on 3 questions we would ask. They're open questions, you will see. And the idea was to come up with the general term, get feedback from all the people we were able to talk to, and then at the end, look at the data and say, we have a common vision. And what we want to do is go back to the individuals and say, hey, you know what? Everybody thinks the same way. That means we have the same vision in our head. So if I feel that way and you feel that way and everybody else feels that way, then we know where we're working towards. And the way that we actually go ahead and achieve it is immaterial. So let me go ahead and play. Okay, Paula, your first question is, tell us, please, what you think regenerative community is. There is no right or wrong answer.
Okay, so I could imagine it being a community of people that want to restore and maintain a good ecosystem and want to use its potential and create maybe a more sustainable environment.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
So is this worthwhile? Should we try to achieve this? Is it worth striving for?
Of course we should. Yeah, okay. For sure.
So now we come to the next question.
Oh, okay.
So how do we do that?
Well, I can imagine it being achieved through circular economy because it is a process that is an open loop process. So basically we don't throw away anything, and we make use of what we already have and try to improve it and basically just repurpose the materials and products that we have.
Okay, I think that actually gave me an opportunity to kind of go through the chat box. Thank you very much for all of your comments. I'm going to go ahead and start with the first comment coming from F. So what is our common vision? I can only tell you what my vision is. I'm not quite sure at this point that it's common. I like to think that it is common. As Paula was mentioning in this video, we need to come up with communities where everything that we take, we're able to go ahead and put back in some fashion. Now, that could take on different forms. One, if we're looking at from an ecological perspective, if we use materials that are part of nature, then we don't have to really think about it too much. Then it automatically goes back into nature, and nature doesn't know any waste. So can you imagine a world, in whatever world that may be, I'm concentrating on my community, if we can go ahead and put together a world where everything that we go ahead and use could be used again and again. And if we were able to go ahead and create a community where everybody has a purpose, and that we're able to go ahead and see this as our main rule, that we do not just take things because we believe that it belongs to us. Now, that would be my vision. So I'm going to go ahead and make a challenge to you. And here's an opportunity if you'd like to go ahead and participate. So that's the call to action. Please feel free to go ahead and tell us what you think your vision is, because you know what? It's important. Yeah, so there are various campaigns that we're actually going ahead. There's the email address. I'll go ahead and leave that in the screen. So that was good. Thank you very much for being so quick to pick that up. It was actually, let me go ahead and put it in the chat. It is regenerativ at kreislaufplatz.wien. And I'll go ahead and make sure that that information is going ahead. I'll go ahead and make sure that all that information is included within the show notes. Yeah, so that would be my vision. So there are a couple other things that we're working on that I'd like to go ahead and share, and then I think that will be about enough for me today. There was one other campaign. Let me go ahead and highlight this. There's another campaign that we're about to start, and we'd be keen on your opinion. One of the reasons why we're putting this live stream together is not just to go ahead and say how great we are, quite the opposite. We're really keen on your opinion. And the idea is to go to children and pose a very simple question. I tend to think that most kids, if you give them the year 2050, that they're going to struggle a little bit in actually bringing some sort of meaning to that. But if we went ahead and turned it around, if we took a 6-year-old and we were to ask the 6-year-old, what do you think the world would look like when you're 35? Now, I don't know about you, but I could actually go ahead and remember when I was younger, when the typical question that you would always get is, so what do you want to do when you grow up? And it was usually around that age when I was 6. And of course, I never knew how to answer the question. Maybe some of you had an answer. I could never answer it. Today, I, of course, being as cheeky as I am, I wish I would have been able to come up with a retort and said, what are the options? But I could have never thought of that as a 6-year-old. And perhaps maybe that might be an indicator for the children that we want to go ahead and talk to. Well, what we plan to do is continue with this process and ask kids, depending upon their age, let's stay with this example of a 6-year-old who would be 35 in the year 2050. So what kind of world would you like to have? Would you like to have when you're 35. And getting back to the question that was posed by F, tied to that common vision, I think that the opinions that we get from those children that we interview are going to be the most meaningful. Why? Because they're going to have to live with the stuff that we're creating right now. So why don't we go ahead and give them an opportunity? So this is going to be the next campaign that we'll be starting with, called Wish List. And I think for some of us, maybe some of the wish of that common goal would be to relish in being with each other and feeling that we're actually going ahead and making a better place for not only for ourselves, but for our children. So I'd like to go ahead and thank you for joining me today. I hope you found some things that were of interest. I'd be very keen on your feedback. And if there's one message that I'd like to leave to all of you on this Earth Day, is that we do have the ability to go ahead and make a difference. So let's go ahead and find that part where we can make a difference and figure out ways to go ahead and support each other. And let's just go ahead and make it happen. As there's wouldn't be an event, certainly from my end, without some sort of call to action. I'd like to go ahead and highlight our next event that will be taking place on the 12th of May. Now, we went ahead and brought some people from different nationalities together to see whether we can come up with better models of how a number of these things should work, looking at if there are end-to-end processes or material flows, and understanding that there has to be a better way. And we felt that by bringing different people together, it would be inclusive. And so what we're doing is we are going to run a design sprint live as a live stream. So in other words, we will bring people together. You will not necessarily watch them as they work through their exercises. It will be on a board just like the one that you see here on the screen. And we will allow for a number of people who have already participated in these exercises an ability to go ahead and shine and talk a little bit about the experience. We'll explain what a design sprint's all about. And so this is an open challenge. I'll be giving another email address, and I'll include this in the show notes, or actually I can go ahead and, no, I'll go ahead and do this another time. It might be easier. So it's an open challenge for you, opportunity as well. If you would like to go ahead and participate in this event that's taking place on the 12th, we give you the opportunity to be part of the action. So please feel free to go ahead and reach out to me, either on LinkedIn. I will go ahead and we've put together a specific email address for this event, and so I will make sure that that information is passed through. But this is a clear challenge for all of you to go ahead and be part of it, because it's one thing for me to go ahead and pass on my pearls of wisdom, but my real goal is to come up with as big of a tent as possible and make it as inclusive as possible. But I can't do this on my own. I need you to be part of it. So consider this opportunity, and really hope to hear from you. Thank you very much for indulging me today on this Earth Day. And I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of the day. And thank you very much again for joining.